Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Dune Universe by Frank Herbert is a reflection of the time period in which the novels were written, which was during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. They were deterrents from an all-out war between powerful factions, and there are quite a few types which exist in this reality in the Dune universe. So it has been a while since we touched on Dune, and so let's get to it. The first are the atomics. In Dune, atomics is a term used for nuclear weapons, and they're basically the same as the nukes we know today, except that by the time of the far future Imperium, their use is almost entirely off limits, and they're also a little bit more advanced. The great houses still hold on to their stockpiles, though treating them like family heirlooms. Nobody wants to be the house without a nuclear deterrent when everyone else has one. That said, using atomics against people is a massive no-go, thanks to the Great Convention, which was a universal agreement that keeps the balance of power in check. The ruling powers, the great houses, the Spacing Guild, and the Empire, the Emperor, all enforce this rule with the understanding that if anyone steps out of line and actually fires off a nuke in a war against soldiers or civilians, the rest of the galaxy will gang up on them and wipe them out with a massive retaliatory strike that would obliterate the planet itself. Paul Atreides even points out in Dune Messiah that every major house has enough firepower to take out at least 50 enemy planets, which just reinforces why nobody dares to push that button. It's a galactic-scale mutual assured destruction. But why such a strong aversion to atomics? I mean, we know why we in the present day today have that rational fear because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in the far future of the Dune galaxy, things got way out of hand during the Baudelairian Jihad, that war against the thinking machines. During that conflict, atomics were used on a terrifying scale, and the results were catastrophic. Earth itself was utterly devastated, and even other key worlds like Corrin also suffered major damage. This played a major role in the rise of the Corrino dynasty. The horror of what happened made humanity wary of ever using them again. But still, the houses stockpiled these nukes, these atomics, but not for use against each other, primarily as a deterrence, but also as a last-ditch defense in case an alien threat ever shows up. Even in a universe without extraterrestrial civilizations, as far as we know, humans never completely trust that something isn't lurking in the void. Maybe those thinking machines are still out there. The most famous use of atomics in Dune was when Paul Atreides blows a hole in Arrakis' shield wall right before the Battle of Arrakeen. Instead of dropping the bomb directly on his enemies, the Sardaukar and the Harkonnen forces, he targets the terrain, causing a landslide and opening the way for the Fremen to charge in. Since he technically isn't nuking people, just rock, he sidesteps the Great Convention's restrictions. It is a bold move that seals his victory and paves the way for his rise to power and being the Emperor. Even though atomics were rarely used in battle, their presence looms over everything. Every house knows that if the wrong person gets desperate enough, the galaxy couldn't burn in nuclear fire, and that's enough to keep even the most ambitious warlords in check. Atomics in Dune aren't just your average nukes, they're more sophisticated. They are multi-stage weapons with apocalyptic abilities. They can be programmed to drill deep into a planet's crust before detonating, unleashing a blast so powerful that a single warhead might have the potential to split a world in half, thereby causing a chain reaction of tectonic and volcanic activity. This would render the world uninhabitable. On top of that, they can also be fine-tuned to emit just a controlled radiation burst, one that can blind anyone unlucky enough to be looking, without outright vaporizing everything in sight, unless of course they're set to full yield, in which case the entire planet is toast. So when Paul Atreides used the atomics against the shield wall on Arrakis, he made sure to keep things as restrained as possible, at least by atomic standards. Instead of letting the bomb burrow into the ground for a catastrophic eruption, he set it to detonate at the surface, releasing only a minuscule fraction of its potential destructive force. It was still a massive flex though. By using atomics, he was directly challenging the established order. But by keeping the explosion small and targeted, he avoided breaking the Great Convention and could justify it to terraforming the terrain before the main assault began. Now let's take a look at another weapon of mass destruction, and this is called the Stone Burner. These were some of the most devastating weapons in the Dune universe, designed for two main purposes: causing widespread destruction or unleashing a brutal radiation burst that dissolved eye tissue, permanently blinding anything caught in the blast radius. Unlike conventional atomics, their explosion didn't spread outward in all directions. It shot straight up and down, cutting deep into the planet's surface like a blade. The yield could be carefully controlled by whoever sets the device, with the most extreme setting allowing the weapon to drill all the way down to the planet's core. If that happened, the sudden release of magma and seismic energy would be enough to rip the entire world apart. Interestingly, despite its immense power, a stone burner wasn't technically classified as an atomic weapon. The fuel source was atomic, but the weapon itself functioned differently. It first detonated an atomic charge within, then harnessed that energy for its devastating effects. This distinction created a legal loophole. While the Great Convention stated that only great houses could own atomics, with this loophole, someone outside that system could theoretically possess a stone burner, not just the atomic fuel to make it work, but the entire thing. However, officially, the Great Convention banned the use of both atomics and stone burners against human targets. But, as with most laws in the Imperium, people found ways to bend or outright ignore the rules. One of the most infamous instances was when a stone burner was used in an assassination attempt against Emperor Paul Atreides. While he and his elite Fatican warriors survived the attack, they were all left permanently blind due to the intense radiation burst. Another example came from Muad'Dib's Second Crusade, when the defenders of Naraj used a stone burner to blind the incoming Fremen troops instead of outright killing them. Whether or not this technically broke the Great Convention was a legal grey area, but the entire Landsraad was against Paul Atreides at this time, so no one did a thing, and it showed that people will find ways to use weapons of mass destruction while skirting the letter of the law. The third weapon here are the Lasbeams. In this universe, there is another way a massive explosion can happen, and that is if a Lasbeam connects with a Holtzman's shield. When this happens, the result is an unpredictable and catastrophic explosion. The reaction can vary in scale, from a small localized detonation to a massive nuclear-level blast that wipes up everything in an area, including the attacker and anyone unlucky enough to be in the vicinity. The severity of the explosion depends on factors like the power of the las gun and the strength of the shield, but even a small engagement can lead to devastating chain reactions. Because of this, using las guns against shielded opponents was outright banned in combat. It wasn't just about ethics or fairness, it was simple self-preservation. No commander wanted their troops to accidentally trigger a battlefield-wide explosion just by firing at the wrong target. So while the armies of the great houses still used las guns in specific situations, they generally avoided engaging shielded targets with these weapons, instead favoring projectile weapons or melee combat. As for whether this violates the Great Convention is a bit of a grey area. The Great Convention strictly forbids the use of atomics against human targets, and the las gun shield interaction can absolutely create a nuclear-scale destruction. However, the explosion is technically an accidental byproduct of the interaction rather than a deliberate deployment of nuclear weaponry. That said, intentionally triggering a shield laser detonation in combat will likely be seen as a gross violation of the convention in spirit, if not outright in letter. This legal ambiguity is part of why such engagements were universally avoided. No one wanted to test whether the Landsraad or the Emperor would consider this a war crime. And the last weapon here is called simply as the weapon. So the weapon, as it came to be known, was a terrifying piece of destruction. It was one of the most devastating tools of war unleashed in the Dune Universe. Originally created by the mysterious Ones of Many Faces, this missile, which is launched via starship, didn't just explode. It unleashed an inferno of unimaginable heat, consuming nearly everything in its path. These mysterious enemies, the Ones of Many Faces, were also called the Enemies of Many Faces. They were these malevolent forces which also created the Futars and directed a war against the Honored Matre, which caused them to flee back into the old Imperium, which then began the War of the Sisterhoods. Anyway, unlike atomics, which relied on radiation and raw explosive power, the weapon worked through sheer thermal devastation, igniting the very atmosphere and turning entire landscapes into molten wastelands. The Honored Matre, as they were fleeing the Ones of Many Faces, took some of these weapons for themselves and used one of these in their most infamous attacks, which was the obliteration of Arrakis, which was the same planet Arrakis but only renamed in the far future after the death of the God Emperor. Their target was a person named Supreme Bashar Miles Teg, the legendary military genius who had humiliated them on Gamu by slaughtering their leadership. The Ornate Matre wanted revenge, and they didn't hold back against him or any sort of resistance in the planet of Arrakis. When the Ornate Matre's missile hit, the result was apocalyptic. The atmosphere itself ignited, and half of it simply evaporated in the ensuing firestorm. The surface of the planet became a blazing inferno, incinerating all life in an instant, humans, sandworms, and everything in between. The extreme heat melted the sands of Arrakis, transforming them into massive stretches of hardened glass, a permanent scar which marked the planet's violent end. In one strike, the Ornate Matre had accomplished their goal. Arrakis was no more, and the last remaining population of sandworms, the key to the Bene Gesserit's control of spice, was wiped out. It was an act of sheer ruthless annihilation, a statement to the rest of the universe that the Matre would stop at nothing to eliminate their enemies. But thankfully though, one specimen of the sandworms was saved and was later released on a planet called Chapter House, and thus ensured a slow revival of the species from near extinction. Now those are the 4 weapons of mass destruction in the Dune universe, at least the original Frank Herbert's universe. Now if you like this video, then watch this other one too, and if you want to browse for other sci-fi or Warhammer content, then check out our channel. So subscribe and like for support. Till the next time, take care, boys.